There we go. Just get primer. Carb heat, mixture full rich, slightly in, and we checked all of this. Okay. We did the brakes, primer brakes. No, this is another brake.
So brakes. So now we're holding the brakes.
So now we're gonna, okay. Holding the brakes, clear prop, and master on. So is that where we shout clear prop?
Correct.
Okay.
You can open your window.
I can't hear me. Clear prop. All right. And
I for ignition. And then before that, so the other thing is turn on the.
So we're gonna go to start.
So we'll turn on the master. And then your hand is on throttle. So one hand on throttle, one hand on keys.
One hand on the keys.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
And then we're gonna go to start.
Yes, we're gonna go.
Okay, at this point, we're talking about the RPMs once the engine cut on. Once you cut the engine on, she was telling me that I need to bring the RPMs down to about 1,000 RPMs. They were a little bit too hot. That normally happens, I guess, when you start the engine.
Mag start. Oh, we testing mag?
Not yet. That'll be during the run. So we kind of back off and start at the end, and that's the second one. Coming up. Good?
So we just want this to be in the green.
Yes. So sitting right at the right now, we don't want to see it in that room.
Okay. And then lights as required. Do you use the lights when you're taxiing and all?
Turn the navigation on.
And then mixture as required. I don't know where we're leading to. Are you leading it to change the RPMs?
Yes. So we'll lead it and we'll do it. So we'll turn it. So it's going to be in the ground around here.
Okay, so you're bringing that back. So you increased a little bit here and then you brought it back to the 1,000. Okay. All right. So now pre-taxi. Seatbelts and harness. Your flaps need to go up. Heat, vent, defrost. Okay. Avionics on.
So now we're putting on a headset. Since the avionics are on, you will not be able to hear what we will be saying. We will be talking through the headset, so our voices will be lower since we can hear each other through the headset. So I'll try to dictate for you what's going on in a flight, some of the procedures that we were doing for the rest of the video. Now we're checking the GPS, the WA system, the ADS-B system, the comms, and she's explaining to me how all of that works. We had two comms, COM 1 and COM 2. COM 1 was tied to the frequency of the airport, and COM 2 was tied to the weather at that airport. She was also telling me about the GPS as well, aside from the comms, and eventually we go in to talk about how to control the volume for the comms. But while we were sitting there, what we were doing was getting all the information. I guess it's the ATIS information. I'm writing that down for the flight, weather, density, altitude, and all of that, so that we can take off properly. At this point, we're going to test the radios, call out to Chesapeake Unicom. So what I had to do was say Chesapeake Unicom, Cessna 20289, radio check, Chesapeake Unicom. Eventually somebody did call back in and said that they heard us loud and clear. So at that point we knew that our radios were working and that other people could hear us on the radio. And then once we did that, we continued to go through the checklist to make sure that we got everything right before we started taxiing. So this is not a towered airport, so I had to call out to Chesapeake traffic, and the way that sounds is Chesapeake traffic, Cessna 20289, taxiing to runway 5 for run up, Chesapeake traffic. And once I got that call out, we were clear to go ahead and start our taxi all the way to runway 5 to the run-up section, where we would have to do more checks before we actually took off. Now don't hold me to this. My call outs may be incorrect because I'm actually recording this voice over a day later. So some of the things I say might not be 100% accurate to what was actually said during the flight, but I'm doing my best because I cannot hear what we're saying, but you get the gist. So this is my third time in a Cessna, my second time taxiing a Cessna 172, that is. And I've also flown a Piper PA-28, the 140 engine. And I gotta say that those two planes are extremely different in the way that they feel. So now this Cessna had toe brakes, whereas the Piper had a handbrake. The Cessna for me was much harder to control while taxiing. I don't think I was in the correct seated position. My feet were a little bit too high, I guess, on the pedals, so I kept hitting the brakes while I was trying to use the pedals to turn. Eventually I did get the hang of it on the Cessna, but it was nothing like the Piper. The Piper for me was so much easier, and the left turning tendencies, just I didn't feel them at all when I was flying the Piper or taxiing the Piper. But you definitely feel them on a Cessna, big time. Eventually I will have to adjust my seat, and once we get to the run-up, but at this point she's showing me where my feet should be on the pedals and how I should push them up to get to the brakes when I need the brakes. But when I'm not on the brakes, on the toe brakes, then my heels need to be on the floor, and I need to be using the pedals with my heels on the floor, pushing back and forth. extremely different from what I'm used to or what I had before on that Cherokee. Overall, I prefer the Cherokee, but I'm not going to let the Cessna get me down. I'm going to keep at it. So while taxiing, I was told that we should be taxiing at a pace of about a brisk walk. I was going a little bit too fast. My ground speed was a little bit too fast. My RPMs were up a little bit too much, so I had to pull back on that throttle a little bit to kind of slow down. Now at this point, we're getting to the run up, so we're going to the run up, and then I have to make this sharp left turn. And for that, I had to really stomp on the brakes, and then really hold down that left brake, and then kind of push throttle up to kind of swing the whole airplane around. I've never done that maneuver before, so it's kind of interesting to see the plane pivot around on itself like that. And at that point, we got to that run up, and then we'll start the run up checklist from there. And this is the point where I'm adjusting my seat, pushing myself back a little bit. I was a little too close, which is probably why my toes kept touching the brakes while I was trying to use the rudders and not the toe brakes. So I had to push myself back just slightly. That did help out a little bit. I also lowered myself a little as well. That helped out a little as well. Eventually, I'm going to have to find a position that really works for me inside the Cessna 172. Now we're going to check to make sure that the control surfaces are moving freely. Me pulling the yoke left and right, that's me checking my ailerons to make sure that they're moving freely. Back and forth is to make sure that the elevators are moving freely. And then I also checked the rudder by using the rudder pedals. So everything was working properly so that we know that if we hold left, we're going to go left. If we go right, we're going to go right. So all that worked as it should work. So then we go to the next spot on the checklist, which we were putting in the carb heat. Now after we put in the carb heat, we also had to make sure that the primer was off, and now we're pushing up the RPMs. And once we push up the RPMs, I want to say we went up to about 2400 RPMs, maybe not quite that high. I forget exactly how high we went on the RPMs, but then after we did that, we wanted to check our mags. And so what we would do is we would, on the key, using the key, is we would go to the right mag, and we should see a reduction in RPMs. And then we go back to both mags. And then we go to the left mag, and then we should see a reduction in RPMs again. And then when we go back to both, RPMs go back up. After we do that, then we want to put on our carb heat. And then we should also see a slight reduction in RPMs. And then we cut our carb heat off, and those RPMs now come back up. And then we check our fuel, make sure that the tanks look good. And then we bring back our RPM to kind of like idle. Now, what I did was I brought it back too fast, according to the instructor. And she said in those planes, you know, sometimes that's not a good thing. We kind of want to bring it back gradually. So that was a lesson learned there. Now we're making sure that our flaps are up or in the takeoff position, whichever one we wanted to do. We went with full flaps up. I guess you can decide, depending on the weather conditions, if you want to go with your flaps down if you want to take off, maybe in like the 10-degree spot. We didn't do that. We took off with 0 flaps. At this point, I'm going to adjust the heading bug, and I believe we adjusted it to runway 5, which was 05, 0 degrees. I believe that's what we did. Don't quote me on it. But yeah, we did adjust the heading bug for our direction. And then after that, we wanted to check to make sure that our doors were sealed properly so that they wouldn't open while we were in flight. Shut the windows to make sure that that wouldn't open while we were in flight. And after that, we wanted to make sure that our lights, our nav lights and our beacon lights were on if needed for takeoff and during flight. So this is the emergency procedure portion, and this is when she takes over and she gives me the emergency procedure plan on how to abort a takeoff. So the example was, if we're in our takeoff and something happens with the engines, they go out before we take off, we'll just keep rolling and try to roll off of the runway. If we get up to about 500 feet and the engines go out, we'll try to land with the rest of the runway that we have remaining. If we're at 1,000 feet and they go out, we'll either pick a field and land that was right in front of the runway. If we go up higher than that, I believe, and the engines go out, then we'll try to make that turn and come back to the airport if we can. So she was just giving me the emergency procedures just in case something happened while we were in our takeoff phase. That way everybody was clear as to what would happen and we can get back down safely. Now that concluded the run-up checklist. And now the next thing we're going to do is taxi to the hold short line. And then once we get there, we're going to make the call out to Chesapeake traffic before we take off. So if you notice, we didn't go nose directly to the hold short area. We were kind of veered off to the right a little bit. But that was so we can see any oncoming traffic in the air and from either direction. It just gave us better visibility to position the airplane that way. And at that point, we started making a call out to Chesapeake traffic, and that sounded something like: Chesapeake traffic, Cessna 20289, holding short at runway 5. And then after that, we didn't hear any calls, so we called again. Chesapeake traffic, Cessna 20289, ready for takeoff, taking off, runway 5, Chesapeake traffic. And at this point, this is where we start our takeoff. So now I start to taxi onto the runway, trying to get to that center line. And at this point, this is where I kick in throttle, and immediately you can feel the airplane start to veer left. You can even see it when you're watching. So I'm having to push that right rudder, and you don't hear it up here, but she is telling me right rudder, right rudder, right rudder, and I'm stomping on it. And then airspeed goes alive, and next thing I know, we're off the ground. At this point, I'm just trying to maintain that, I want to say she said 85 knots airspeed, so I'm pitching for that airspeed. Also have my foot on a rudder, trying to stay center, trying to trim everything out. At this point, my mind is on fire. There's so much happening at this point. So we skip ahead a little bit, and now we're at about 3,500 feet, and I'm just getting comfortable with the plane itself, flying straight and level, and just really getting the feel for how the plane operates. We're talking about RPMs, we're talking about throttle adjustments, overall aerodynamics of the plane, things like that. Some of the things that you would learn during your ground school sessions. The day before this particular flight, I flew with another school, and that's when I flew that Piper PA-28 140. And I gotta say, again, they are so different in the way that they handle. For me, the way I can describe the Cessna is it feels like I'm flying a bus. Everything is difficult. Doing turns, it's the control surfaces are very heavy. When you're pulling back, when you're banking left and right, feels extremely heavy. Versus the Piper, everything feels really light. Sometimes a little bit too light, but for me, it was easier to get used to that because I didn't have to over control. I felt like I had to over control on the Cessna, whereas the Piper, it flew great. It's like driving your regular car versus driving a bus. That's the best way that I can describe it. The instructor really wanted me to test out the controls and get a feel for the airplane. So I was just doing kind of slow turns, but she took over and was like, no, get a real feel. So she did a serious yank and bank there, which you really felt that. I kind of felt it in my stomach. So I was like, okay, I can do that. And yeah, you really have to move those control surfaces to get that thing to move the way you want it to move. It's kind of like you can't be shy on the controls. You really have to. You want to give it throttle, give it throttle. You want to turn, go ahead and move that yoke left or right. Do what you want to do. It's kind of no place to be timid with the controls. That's a good lesson learned for me, at least. Now, at this point, we're talking about coordinated turns. Now, she noticed that when I was turning, that I was applying rudder right at the point that I was turning, and that kind of threw the turns off. They weren't as coordinated as they could be, so we went into a little lesson on really doing coordinated turns the proper way. So we were talking about the dynamics of the wings and how the wings interact and how the plane is going to fly when you do the turns the proper way. And you can really feel the difference when you do a proper coordinated turn versus what I was doing. It's a feel. Like there's the science behind it, the bookwork that you learn, but when you actually get up in the sky and you start doing the maneuvers, you really get a sense for what the book is talking about, because now you can feel it. You're experiencing those things for yourself. we were going to be doing some maneuvers, some slow flight maneuvers in a particular area. So we wanted to make sure that we called into Chesapeake Traffic to notify traffic in the area of our intentions. We were going to be flying around this one particular area that's a practice area for them, for that flight school, and do some slow flying maneuvers. So I had to call out to the Chesapeake Traffic area to let them know. And that sounded something like this. Chesapeake Traffic, Cessna 20289. And I gave my heading. I don't know what heading it was, and I actually gave the name of the practice field. I forget what the name. I want to say it's called Radon, but I gave that to them. And then after that, you say Chesapeake Traffic once you give them all the information. There was no one else in the area, in that same practice field area, but it's good to communicate, especially when you're in non-towered areas, to let everybody know what's going on. That way everyone's safe. Everyone knows what's going on, and you don't have any mid-air collisions. So now we're going into a stall. Now this was my first time doing a stall. Me actually doing the stall. So we went into some slow flight, so I was able to pull the throttle back to idle, and then I pulled the yoke back, the elevator, to bleed off that airspeed. And this was a very small stall, so the nose didn't tip over drastically, but it did tip over. And then I was able to get that throttle back in place and get back to straight and level flight. You would think that stalling out an airplane is scary, but it's actually not. The plane is extremely docile. You know, the nose just tips over. You're still in the air flying, and you're just going at a really slow pace. And as soon as you put that throttle back in, it kicks back up, and you're back off at it. It's not that big of a deal, but it is extremely important to practice, and that way you can know how to handle yourself in a situation where your airplane may stall out, or you may do something wrong to inadvertently cause a stall. And these are all good procedures to practice, but it's not scary at all. It's actually kind of be quite enjoyable, but that's just me. Now we're going into a power on stall, which is different than a power off stall. So the power off stall would simulate you going in for a landing when you're going all the way down to idle throttle, and it's possible that that plane can stall out on you while you're trying to go in for a landing. The power on stall is simulating you doing a takeoff, and your attitude might be a little bit too high. And the crazy part is, I asked her, I said, well, in what situation would you be in a power on stall? And right when I asked that question, I immediately knew what the answer was. I don't even know why I asked that question. I kind of went blank while I was up there flying. I knew it was during a takeoff situation, but she did take the time to explain that it was going to be on a takeoff. And that is a very interesting stall. I mean, your plane, your nose is kind of pointed really high up at a steep angle, and then next thing you know, it just drops. It's kind of like you're flying almost straight up, but moving forward and not gaining any more altitude. And then all of a sudden, the nose drops. And then you got to adjust to recover from the stall. A very interesting experience. I haven't done a power on stall myself, but I've been in a plane where we've done it twice now. So this was the second time that I was in a power on stall. Interesting experience. One of the things that I kept doing was trimming the wrong way. Um, I don't know what it is about that trim wheel, but I would try to trim for nose down and go the opposite way. Then I would try to trim for nose up and then go the opposite way. But I will say trimming is vital. It's a necessity inside that Cessna. Like I said, those control surfaces are extremely heavy. So, I was definitely wanting to trim out all that extra weight to make the flying experience a little bit easier. But yeah, I just wasn't doing the trim wheel the right way. And so she went in and started explaining to me, how to trim the proper way. And at this point, we're doing a pretty steep turn, which was cool. We're doing a 45-degree angle turn to the right. And so I had to trim up a little bit. So she said, pitch, throttle, and then trim. So that's what I did. I pitched to the right angle. I got my throttle the right way. And then I put my trim in to ease up some of that pressure. And then we came out of it. So at this point, we're going to speed up a little bit. We are heading home. So we're descending from 3,500 feet to about 2,000 feet. And we're turning to follow this creek, using that as a visual reference to get ourselves back to the airport. Now, what I did notice is I do have a difficult time descending. Like pitching down and getting that throttle and kind of keeping my pace the same. I was kind of all over the place. At one point I was descending 1,000 feet a minute, then I was descending at 500 feet a minute. It was very difficult for me to kind of keep it steady. But then when we did get down to about 2,000 feet, man, that weather, it was something else. You talking about just being kicked all over the place by the turbulence. We had crosswinds like crazy, and that was a very different experience. I was on that rudder, trying to maintain the stability of the airplane, but I actually liked it. I don't know what the instructors' personal minimums are, but I do want to find out. So now we're in the vicinity of the airport, and we're going to make a call out to the airport to let them know that our exact location and what our intentions are out and around the airport. I believe at this point we're still descending to about 1,000 feet, and we called out to the airport to let them know that we were going to be entering the traffic on a right pattern. So we're still using visual aids, landmarks to guide ourselves to the airport. And then pretty soon we're going to find ourselves on the downwind leg Then we're going to wind up being on the base leg, and then she's going to take over once we get to the final leg and do the landing herself. At this point, the instructor takes over for pretty much the rest of the flight until we get on the ground, and then I taxi back to the actual school itself. But I will say this instructor was pretty thorough. This was my third school that I went to, so this would be my third logged flight. However, I've done 5 flights total. The first 2 flights I did not log. But the last 3 I did, and this was my third flight. And the other 2 schools, the instructors were great, the schools were great, the planes were great, but by far she was the most thorough and methodical teacher that I've had so far. So I definitely enjoyed that experience. Who knows? I may stick with this same flight school. The one thing I will say, I don't like the G5s. I prefer a straight 6-pack right now. I just don't like the layout of the G5s and having to see the way the information is set up. I guess I still prefer the vacuum gauges, the old 6-pack, and I'll have to get used to the G5s. One of the other schools had G1000s. I didn't like them at all. There was a Cessna 172 with G1000s. I really didn't like them. But I will say that I do like the 6-pack for now. Now on that landing, we did hit a gust of wind as we were landing, because she was spot on, and then that wind right before we touched down just came in and picked the plane right back up. We had a strong gust, and it was a headwind, picked us right back up, but she handled it very well. And at this point, I kind of take over the taxiing, and I taxi back to the school. But no, this instructor was great. I just might wind up at this school to finish off, get my hours, and do my private pilot through them. It's a lot to be said about having a good instructor. The other schools, I felt kind of rushed. Previous school, the one with the G1000s, I really didn't have time to adjust. It was a late flight. When we came back in for our landing, it was nighttime, and I just felt really rushed. I did like the instructor though, but it just felt rushed for time. This one I didn't feel rushed at all. You know, we sat there, we did the pre-flight. She let me do the pre-flight, which is actually the first instructor that let me do the pre-flight. She just sat there with me and guided me through. None of the others did it. They did it themselves. So I felt like I learned a lot more with this instructor than I did with all the other instructors.
Okay. Awesome. Oh, it hurt?
They pop.
Ah, yes. And then we turn mags off. Master off. And close the left. And then lights come on. And put back to your ground.
All right, so that concludes my flight. Man, I enjoyed it. It just lets me know that I should have done this a long time ago. But I'm gonna stick with it. I'm gonna get all my hours, and I'm gonna get this private pilot license. And hopefully y'all stick with me on my journey. Thanks for watching. And come back. I'll have more videos later on for some of my other flights, and hopefully if they let me, I'll be able to record the cockpit audio as well. I just got to get another device for that, but hopefully they'll let me, and I can bring you guys some more videos on my journey with getting my private pilot's license. Thanks for watching again.